Stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I'm doing some light secretarial work with Minh Thi Phan, the new Seeker Investigator from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. Will Min resist the temptation to read Act 2 of the dreaded King in Yellow, or will the hideous tome drive her insane like her boss, Mr. Thomas? There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing, so with that in mind, let's get started. Minh Thi Phan has 4 willpower, 4 intellect, 2 combat, and 2 agility. She has the assistant trait, 7 health, and 7 sanity. She has the response trigger. After an investigator at your location commits a card to a skill test, that card gains a wild icon until the end of the test. Limit once for each investigator per round. Her Elder Sign ability is +1, and you may choose a skill card committed to this skill test to return it to its owner's hand after the test ends. Now, Min's stats are quite similar to those of her Seeker counterparts, Daisy Walker and Rex Murphy. She has the highest willpower of the 3 Seekers at 4. That should help protect her from many of the treacheries the encounter deck throws her way. However, she can't leverage her willpower in quite the same way as Daisy, since, as we'll see in a moment, Min does not have access to cards in the Mystic class. Min has the highest intellect of all the investigators in the Path to Carcosa at 4, but she does lag behind Daisy in that department. Min's combat and agility are a paltry 2 apiece, which shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody. Arkham's nerds aren't the strongest or most agile bunch. However, Min's health and sanity are a very respectable 7 apiece, so Min might not be good in a fight or particularly good at evading enemies, but she is the most durable Seeker of the bunch, that's for sure. Now, Min has the assistant trait, which aptly describes the support role that many players are going to expect her to fill in multiplayer games. Back in the Corset-only days, Daisy was considered to be the weakest solo investigator. Sure, she could gather clues like a hot dam and race through a scenario before the encounter deck had a chance to stop her, but she could neither fight nor evade enemies with any consistency. Once an enemy or 2 hit the table, Daisy was in serious trouble because she lacked the tools to deal with them. Seekers have a lot more options at their disposal these days thanks to the release of powerful cards during the Dunwich Legacy cycle, such as Pathfinder, I've Got a Plan, and Dr. William T. Mallison. But enemy management remains a serious problem that Seekers must contend with during scenarios. Much like Daisy before her, Min is going to struggle once an enemy or 2 hits the table. And that's the big reason I suspect that many players are going to relegate Min to multiplayer games, leaving her solo adventures to only the bravest or most foolhardy players, depending on your point of view. Min is definitely playable in solo, though, and in fact, I think her special ability makes her slightly better prepared than her Corset counterpart to tackle the mythos on her own. Now, Min's special ability reinforces the idea that she's intended to play a support role in multiplayer. Basically, once per round per investigator, she can boost an investigator's skill value by 1 as long as that investigator commits a card to a skill test. It's not a very flashy ability compared to some of the other investigators in the Path to Carcosa, like Safina Russo or Lola Hayes, but it can be quite powerful because it plays around with the probability of the Chaos Bag. Let's assume for a moment that we're playing extracurricular activity with Daisy and Min. The Chaos Bag in that scenario isn't very spiky. Most of the tokens in it are, including the special tokens, are -1s, so it should be relatively easy to calculate the probability of success on a given skill test. Now, if Daisy's skill value equals the skill test's difficulty, she has a 26.67% chance of succeeding. If she commits 1 card with an appropriate skill icon, her chance of success jumps to 66.67%. If she commits 2 cards or 1 card with 2 skill test icons of the appropriate type, her chance of success rises to 80%. Now, as you can see from this example, Daisy gets the largest bonus from the first skill icon she commits. The bonus she gets from every skill icon she commits after the first is subject to diminishing returns. Min's ability lets you manipulate these probabilities in a very subtle but powerful way. If Min's skill value equals the skill test difficulty and she commits one card with an appropriate skill icon and triggers her response, her chance of success skyrockets to 80%. Now that's pretty great, although it's important to realize that Min still had a pretty good chance of passing the skill test without triggering her response due to the impact of diminishing returns. In fact, I think you can make a pretty compelling argument that triggering Min's response is kind of wasted in these types of situations unless it's absolutely critical to pass the skill test. Min's ability really comes into its own when her skill value is lower than the skill test difficulty. If the skill test difficulty is too higher than an investigator's skill value, a typical investigator would need to commit at least 3 skill icons to have a 66.67% chance of success. Min needs to commit only 2 cards or better, 1 card with 2 skill icons of the appropriate type, to generate the same chance of success. In the long run, Min's ability is not only going to improve your odds of passing the critical skill test, but it's also going to save you cards and resources, which you can use to build your board state or commit to other tests later in the game. And in the long run, it's just going to help you win games. Now, of course, all these numbers come with the usual caveats about the odds of pulling a certain token from the chaos bag, which can change dramatically between scenarios and difficulty levels. As we've seen in the Dunwich Legacy and the Path to Carcosa, they can even change dramatically in the middle of a scenario. So you might start with a lot of -1s in the Chaos Bag during extracurricular activity, but that could change during the campaign, so you'll need to adjust the odds and the number of cards and/or resources you commit to skill tests accordingly. Now, if you're playing on standard difficulty, the rule of thumb is that you want to be about 2 over the skill test difficulty before you pull from the bag. So if you're expecting to make multiple skill tests during a round, the question becomes, how do you decide when to trigger Min's response? So what these numbers suggest to me is that Min gets the biggest bang for her ability when her skill value is lower than the skill test difficulty. And when is Min's skill value most likely to be lower? Well, that's on combat and agility tests. And that's the reason I think Min is slightly better positioned than Daisy at combat and evasion, because once per round she does get that little extra boost that Daisy does not. Now, unfortunately for Min, her special ability is limited to once per round. And so if she needs to make multiple combat or agility skill tests per round, say against an enemy with a lot of health, she's going to need to have a backup plan, or she could find herself seriously outgunned. Min's ability is even better in multiplayer because she can trigger her response once per round per player. Suddenly, every investigator's weakest stat just got a little bit stronger. Min could even trigger her response multiple times on the same skill test, enabling an investigator to accomplish some truly heroic feats. Now, Min's Elder Sign ability is about as corner case as they come. The only way you're going to have any hope of triggering it is by playing a high number of skill cards in your deck, because that's the only type of card you can return to your hand if you happen to pull an Elder Sign. Now, Min already wants cards like Unexpected Courage and Inquiring Mind, so that shouldn't be too big of a problem. You will get a skill card back every now and then when you pull an Elder Sign token, but I certainly wouldn't count on it. In all the games I've played with Min so far, I think I've triggered it once. So, yeah, it's going to happen, but it's going to be a pretty rare occurrence. So now that we've got a better understanding of what Min's special ability does, let's take a look at her deck building restrictions. Min has the standard deck size of 30 cards. She can use Seeker cards level 0 to 5, Neutral cards level 0 to 5, and Survivor cards level 0 to 2. So she's quite similar to the Investigators from the core set in that regard. As I mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a shame that Min can't use Mystic cards to put that 4 willpower to good use, but there are plenty of powerful options in the Survivor class to spur your deck building creativity. There are a lot of different ways you could go with Min, probably too many to mention here, but these are just a few of the ideas that I had when I was looking at the card pool. Probably the first card you want to consider when you're building your min deck is Dark Horse. That card has become an archetype unto its own since it was released in the Undimensioned and Unseen Mythos pack. And there's a Dark Horse build for just about every investigator who can take it over on Arkham DB. Obviously, bumping Min's stat line to 5 willpower, 5 intellect, 3 combat, and 3 agility is a really attractive option, but you definitely need to build around Dark Horse. The trick to building a deck around the Dark Horse is to keep your cost curve low enough so that you can run on as few resources as possible. Dark Horse decks also tend to favor assets and skills over events, which don't synergize particularly well with Dark Horse because they tend to be expensive. If you're planning to jam a copy of Dark Horse into your min deck, you may want to reconsider a card like I've Got a Plan, that event from the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack. It's been a staple in Seeker decks since it's been released, but it does cost 3 resources, which can be difficult to save up if you're trying to maximize the benefit that you get from Dark Horse. So if you've got to forego I've Got a Plan, then you're going to need to look at other combat options for min. Fortunately, the Survivor class has several good cards that you can use to shore up Min's combat. You've got the Fire Axe, which many people consider to be one of the best weapons in the game, as well as the Baseball Bat and the Gravedigger's Shovel, all of which will give Min's combat skill a sizable boost. Of course, there's also the lowly Knife from the core set and the much maligned Kukri from the Dunwich Legacy. I've tested all of them but the Kukri in my min deck, and there are pros and cons to each. Personally, I prefer the Fire Axe for the combat boost and the damage bonus. Initially, I was quite high on the Baseball Bat, but it takes up 2 hand slots, and if you happen to draw Min's signature weakness, the King in Yellow, you'll have to ditch the bat, which is really adding insult to injury at that point. The Shovel's ability to grab a clue without making a skill test is pretty tempting to include it in your deck, but trying to kill anything hardier than a rat with it is really tedious and time consuming, and I'd much rather go with a weapon that has some sort of combat boost attached. The Survivor class gives Min access to some of the most powerful recursion cards in the game, and those include Scavenging, a chance encounter, and Resourceful. Now, Scavenging is no stranger to Seeker decks. Certain Rex Murphy builds would combine his response trigger with Scavenging, Burglary, and plenty of cards with the item trait for all sorts of Investigate shenanigans. If Rex succeeded by 2 on a Burglary Investigate skill test, he could gain 3 resources, 1 clue, and return an item card to his hand. I think you'll agree that that's pretty great value for 1 skill test. Now, Min can't leverage Scavenging in quite the same way as Rex, but she can still use the Survivor talent to recur items like the Baseball Bat that I mentioned earlier. Other interesting Scavenging targets are items with wild skill test icons. As we'll see in a moment, Min really likes cards with wild skill test icons. Rabbit's Foot and Strange Solution Unidentified are 2 such cards, and Min can recycle them, providing herself with a steady supply of cards that she can pitch to skill tests. If Min triggers her response when she pitches those cards, they basically become like extra copies of Unexpected Courage, and we know most players are packing 2 copies of that in their deck. There are plenty of great allies in the Seeker and Survivor that Min can recruit in her battle against the Mythos. First off, there's every Seeker's favorite etymologist, Dr. Mylan Christopher, who boosts her intellect and resource generation. Now, most players would never consider playing any other ally but Dr. Mylan Christopher, but Dr. William T. Mallison is earning some fans because he provides you a measure of control over the encounter deck. And of course, there is Peter Sylvester in the Survivor class. His ability to soak horror can win you games that you probably should have lost, and he is just an overall amazing ally. With so many allies, great allies to choose from, purchasing a copy or two of Charisma is going to be very tempting in Min. And don't forget that you can use that Survivor event chance encounter to recur them all, so you can play them multiple times per game. Evasion is another interesting, albeit fairly challenging option that you could explore in Min. Her base agility of 2 isn't that great, but the Seeker and Survivor card pools do contain several useful ways to boost her agility, including Hyper Awareness and Peter Sylvester. They also have quite a few cards that help with evasion, such as Close Call and Bait and Switch, which I've used with some success in other evasion decks to manage enemies. Now, Min's signature cards are Analytical Mind and the King in Yellow, respectively. Analytical Mind reinforces the idea that Min really excels in multiplayer. It's a 3-cost event with, 3-cost asset with 2 wild icons and the talent trait. It allows Min to commit 1 card to each skill test performed by an investigator at another location. It also has the following response trigger after you commit exactly 1 card to a skill test. Exhaust Analytical Mind to draw 1 card. Analytical Mind's first ability is irrelevant in solo, but it's absolutely gold in multiplayer. The ability to commit 1 card to a skill test performed by an investigator at any location synergizes nicely with Min's ability, and it enables players to spread out to different locations, confident in the knowledge that Min's got their backs if they get tagged by a skill test that they can't quite pass. Now, encouraging investigators to spread out also increases the value of Seeker cards such as Seeking Answers, Deciphered Reality, and In the Know, which allow a Seeker to discover clues at other locations. Min can sit back, stay out of danger, and support her fellow investigators during skill tests and investigate from a distance. It all works rather seamlessly, and it's almost like the designers thought of everything. Now, triggering Analytical Mind's response to draw a card is going to be great in solo and multiplayer. Draw is amazing, and if you pitch a card to a test, you're going to get 1 back, so it's simple yet very powerful. The designers were certainly smart to add an exhaust clause to Analytical Mind because it would be crazy powerful otherwise. Now, as much as I like Analytical Mind, I have yet to see it hit the table in many of my solo games with Min. There are a couple reasons for that. First of all, I was playing a Dark Horse build, so saving 3 resources to play Analytical Mind can be challenging once Dark Horse hits the table. And 2 Analytical Mind's 2 wild icons are extremely valuable due to Min's signature weakness, the King in Yellow. Now, the King in Yellow is a tome with the revelation, put the King in Yellow into play in your threat area. It cannot leave play except through the responsibility, and while the King in Yellow is in play, you cannot commit exactly 1 or 2 cards to a skill test. It has the response trigger after a skill test is successful, in which Minh Thi Phan has committed at least 6 matching skill icons for that test. Discard the King in Yellow. It also takes up a hand slot. Now, I'm going to come right out and say it. I hate the King in Yellow. I absolutely hate this thing. I've hated it since the first time I saw it when FFG previewed the card before the release to the Path to Carcosa. And my experience with it has only reinforced my hatred for it. During my first 3 solo games with Min, I drew the King in Yellow early. In a couple of those games, I wasn't ready for it, and it absolutely wrecked me. In one game, I did manage to commit at least 6 matching skill icons to a test, but that effort really gutted my hand, and I didn't have enough time to recover, and ultimately I went down to defeat. If I lose a game with Min, the King in Yellow is usually to blame in some way for the loss. I'm not sure what people's experience has been in multiplayer, where the King in Yellow might not be so bad, but in solo it can be downright fatal. So what's so bad about the King in Yellow? Well, if you draw this thing at the wrong time, it can just make Min's life miserable. Say, for example, Min's engaged with an enemy. Min will usually need to commit a card or two to pass the combat or agility test, but if the king in yellow is in play, you can't do that. And if you don't have the 6 combat or agility icons handy, you can quickly find yourself locked down by the enemy, unable to kill it and unable to escape. In the end, you'll just die a slow death as the enemy attacks you several turns in a row. If you happen to be armed with a baseball bat when you draw the king in yellow, you're going to have to discard the bat, which can really put you in a no-win situation. This happened to me in a recent game. I was all set to take out a big bat with my baseball bat. I drew the king in yellow. I had to discard the bat, and I had 2 combat, and that wasn't going to be nearly enough, and I just proceeded to get killed. So, yeah, just another knock against the king in yellow. The king in yellow is also potentially fatal because really the only way to break its hold over Min is to commit at least 6 matching skill icons to a test. Now, it's important to remember that Min's special ability does help in this regard, but you're still going to need to commit at least 3 cards to the skill test. And depending on the spread of test icons in your hand, you may need to commit to 4 or even 5 cards. In this regard, the king in yellow reminds me a lot of Amnesia, the basic weakness from the core set that forces you just to discard all but 1 card from your hand. You might be able to get away with discarding only 3 cards to the king in yellow, but there's a pretty good chance you could end up losing most of your hand to the tome. That's not fatal in and of itself, but you could be in for a very rough ride for the remainder of the scenario, unless you're able to restock your hand quickly. God forbid you end up with Amnesia as your basic weakness when you're playing Min. The thought of potentially pitching my hand twice a game, that just sounds terrible. The other problem with the king in yellow is that it's just not enough to commit 6 matching skill icons. Oh no, you need to succeed at the skill test to discard the king in yellow. Now, you should be able to pass a skill test if you commit 6 matching skill icons, but there is always that chance of failure due to the nature of the chaos bag, especially if you're playing on higher levels of difficulty. It hasn't happened to me yet, but you just know there's going to be some poor player out there who's going to pitch most of their hand to a skill test in the hope of discarding the king of yellow, and they're going to draw the tentacle. And if that happens to you, you absolutely have my permission to flip the table. You might want to tell your friends about it before you do it, but I cannot imagine the frustration that would ensue if you fail the skill test after you go through all that work. That would be brutal. I wouldn't quit the game or anything, but man, that would just suck. So what's a player to do about the king in yellow? Well, I mentioned earlier in the episode that Min really likes cards with the wild skill icon, and this is the main reason why. If you take a look at entry 1.9 in the Arkham Horror LCG FAQ, the FAQ, a wild skill icon on a player card may be used to match any other skill icon for the purposes of both card abilities and counting how many matching skill icons are committed to a skill test. When using wild icons for the purpose of resolving a card ability, a player must state which icon the wild icon is matching at the time the card is played. So it stands to reason that the more cards with wild skill icons you include in your Min deck, the easier it is for her to muster the 6 matching skill icons she needs to discard the king in yellow. Fortunately for Min, there are quite a few cards to choose from with wild skill icons. In addition to Min's signature card, Analytical Mind, and Unexpected Courage from the core set, Min can take Inquiring Mind, No Stone Unturned, and Strange Solution Unidentified in the Seeker class. Now, depending on the build you've gone for in Min, you could also look at a card like Cunning Distraction or Rabbit's Foot in the Survivor class. I'm hesitant to include Rise to the Occasion on that list since you can only commit it to very specific skill tests, which means it might end up being a dead draw, and those 3 wild icons will simply go to waste. It's important to remember that you can still use Min's special ability to add a wild icon when you discard those or you commit those cards to the test to get rid of the king in yellow. So, for example, if you need to pass a willpower skill test, you could pitch the Cunning Distraction and trigger Min's ability, which will add 3 willpower icons to the test and 2 more cards, and you're well on your way to discarding the king in yellow. Let's just hope you don't draw the tentacle. You know, speaking from personal experience, the king in yellow certainly has the potential to wreck you if you're unprepared to deal with it. So I think it's very important when you sit down to build your min deck that you pay close attention to the spread of skill icons in it, because I think they matter more for her than perhaps any other investigator in the game. I think it helps to try and visualize which cards you would pitch to skill tests in order to discard the king in yellow. Say, okay, I've got a combat skill test, which cards will I pitch? If I'm making a willpower test, which cards would I pitch? And intellect, etc., etc. And if you can't come up with good combinations for that, then I think you really need to reconsider the cards in your deck. And during a game, you can try to minimize the impact the king in yellow has by maintaining a healthy hand size, giving yourself plenty of options to discard, and carefully considering which cards you commit to skill tests. You know, it's awfully tempting to pitch that Unexpected Courage or Inquiring Mind to a skill test, but if you haven't drawn the king in yellow yet, you might be better off hanging on to it in the long run, because those cards can certainly help you out a great deal if the king in yellow rears its ugly yellow head. So what does a Minh Thi Phan deck look like? Well, the answer to that question depends a lot on whether you're playing solo or multiplayer. If you're building a solo deck, you need to cover all the fundamentals. That's combat, investigation, and to a lesser extent evasion. If you're building a multiplayer deck, you can probably skimp a little bit on combat as long as you team up with another investigator who can bail you out if you happen to pick a fight with the wrong enemy. Now, I'm the first to admit that I'm not the strongest deck builder out there, but I found it really hard to build a good min deck for solo play. I'm not sure whether I was just the victim of bad draws, variants, or just poor card choices, but the deck had to go through several iterations before I was able to put up a W during testing, and I think the deck could probably still use a little bit more fine-tuning. In the end, I couldn't resist the temptation to build a min deck around Dark Horse. The static stat boost is just too good to pass up. Now, Dark Horse doesn't play very well with I've Got a Plan, so I included 2 copies of Fire Axe and 2 copies of Knife to shore up her combat. I did test the baseball bat, but it really hurts to lose it to the king in yellow. When I was playing a recent game, I was fighting the big bad. I was all ready to smack it, and just, yeah, things didn't end well. It's also important to note that the baseball bat doesn't play very well with the Chaos Bag in the Path to Carcosa campaign, so you may want to give it a pass for the time being. I'm also not sure whether I should replace the knives with 2 copies of Mind Over Matter. Mind Over Matter is a little more versatile because you can pitch it to use your intellect for a combat or evasion or agility checks, depending on the circumstances, but it does cost a resource, which is certainly a consideration when you're playing Dark Horse. Now, obviously, Magnifying Glass is a great way to boost your intellect during investigate checks, while Rabbit's Foot draws you a card if you fail a skill test. It also has an all-important wild icon for the king in yellow. I've included 2 copies of each in my deck, though I could certainly see going down to 1 apiece. I haven't had a chance to test Scavenging in the deck yet, so I'd probably remove a Magnifying Glass and Rabbit's Foot to make room for it. If you don't want to go the Scavenging route and want to put more skills in, you could certainly remove, I think you could probably get away with 1 copy of Magnifying Glass and 1 copy of Rabbit's Foot to make room for, say, a Perception or a Manual Dexterity. I decided to go with Dr. William T. Mallison in the ally slot. He's cheap, and he lets me shuffle an encounter card back into the deck for a clue, which Min shouldn't have too much trouble discovering. Malison will also help you turn on your inquiring mind because he can allow you to drop a clue at a location, which will enable you to play that skill for the three wild icons, which can be a real lifesaver when you need to pass a skill check. There are 2 copies of Strange Solution unidentified in the deck. Ultimately, the plan is to identify the solution so I can replace it with the Acidic Ichor, which is a really amazing weapon from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack. Once I've got the Ichor in the deck, I would definitely swap out the knives for something else. Maybe at that point I could add the Mind Over Matter, although I'm not sure I would need it so much for the combat because the Ichor is truly a sensational weapon, and it doesn't take up a hand slot, which is just gross. There are 2 copies of No Stone Unturned to help me tutor up Dark Horse if I don't see it in my opening hand, or if I'm worried about enemies, it can find me a weapon. And of course, there's a couple copies of Shortcut. It's really a no-brainer. It's that free move is just fantastic, and the card is golden every time I draw it. Now you might be surprised that I excluded Lucky from the deck. I was kind of surprised myself, to be honest. I've included Lucky in some of my other Dark Horse decks, and it was in the original version of this deck, but the deck just seemed to flow a lot better without it. Sometimes saving that resource for the Lucky with the Dark Horses can be tricky, and this deck doesn't really have a good way of dumping resources besides the Fire Axe. I also was unhappy to discover that Lucky lacks a skill icon, which can really make a big difference if you happen to be tagged by the King in Yellow. I drew the King in Yellow and had a couple of Luckies in my hand during one game because I was saving them for important skill tests, and then realized that these cards that I had saved were not going to help me get rid of my weakness. There are 12 skill cards in the deck. I think Deduction and Inquiring Mind are pretty obvious includes. They just help you. Inquiring Mind can help you with any skill test, and as long as there's a clue there. And Deduction helps you gather those clues that much quicker. I really like Resourceful in Min. I think it's almost like having a 3rd or 4th copy of Unexpected Courage if you trigger it in conjunction with Min's ability. You can also use it to recur your Rabbit's Foot or a Dark Horse if you happen to lose it, lose those cards to Asset Hate. So overall, I'm quite happy with how the deck has performed in testing. I managed to scrape through the House Always Wins, one of the first scenarios in the Dunwich Legacy cycle, and it can be a tough scenario due to the high number of enemies that crop up in it. I took down the experiment in extracurricular activity with a little help from the alchemical concoction, and the deck cruised through the Miskatonic Museum, but that's to be expected due to Min's high intellect. I also managed to beat Curtain Call with it, which has proved to be a very difficult scenario to take down with any consistency in solo play. I don't know what it's like in multiplayer, but man, that thing can be a bear in solo play if you get the wrong draws. I think it's interesting to compare my build with one posted by Dread Reaper over on Arkham DB. Dread Reaper forgoes almost all of the Survivor cards with the exception of Lucky in favor of a more mono Seeker build that uses card draw to fuel Min's ability. The deck uses Laboratory Assistant, Strange Solution, and Preposterous Sketches to fuel that card draw, falling back on I've Got a Plan, Mind Over Matter, and Overpower for combat until she can upgrade to the Acidic Ichor. Of course, he's using Seeker staples like Magnifying Glass, Deduction, and Perception to help Min overcome those difficult investigate checks that she can't overcome with her natural intellect of 4. I haven't had a chance to test Dread Reaper's build, but I suspect it'll probably work better in multiplayer than solo. I'm not entirely comfortable relying solely on I've Got a Plan and Mind Over Matter for combat, especially in combat heavy scenarios. But you know, this is an LCG, and your experience may differ. I think it's important to note that Dread Reaper does include a really extensive write-up about the deck. So if you're interested in playing Min, I would highly recommend that you check it out and take it for a spin and see how it plays. That's going to wrap up my look at Minh Thi Phan. She's not the flashiest investigator in the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, but her ability is undeniably powerful. Min's special ability and signature cards really lend themselves to multiplayer, and I think that's where she's going to see most play, and that's perfectly fine. You know, not every investigator that the designers publish for this game needs to be a superstar in solo and multiplayer. There are obviously going to be some investigators that do better in one or the other, and I think Min's abilities really lend themselves to multiplayer play. That said, she's certainly capable of holding her own in solo if you've got the right build. Of course, enemy management is still a concern, but that's true of all solo seekers, and not just Min. The King in Yellow can be a royal pain in the ass, though, so you've got to make sure you pay attention to the icon spread in your deck. And when you're playing the game, keep it in mind, and it doesn't hurt to hold back a few cards just in case you draw it. It's not a bad idea either. So if you pick up the Path to Carcosa, don't hesitate to give Min a try. Every team of investigators needs a capable assistant, and I think Min fits that bill nicely. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you could give me a thumbs up if you're watching this on YouTube, or a rating on iTunes. Make sure if you have any comments, leave them down below. I always like to hear from you. Let me know what your experience with Min has been, or if you'd make any changes to the decks that I've posted here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to reach me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter @manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.